Venice, the exotic island on the Adriatic, was the bride of the sea. Under the protection of Constantinople, she had grown rich and colorful, dealing with the East. Palaces of pink and golden marble lined her limpid blue-green canals and were mirrored in the water. Slim black gondolas with canopies of crimson carried their elegant owners to the bridge of the Rialto, the financial heart of the city. There the wealthy Venetians invested their golden ducats in private enterprise, or purchased shares in the state-owned galleys that sailed in fleets across the Mediterranean. All this prosperity was threatened, now that Constantinople had fallen. Before too long, the great center of commerce on the sea would move westward to Portugal. Yet for a while, Venetian galleys would still be seen in every harbor of the inland sea, picking up cargoes of spices from India, jewels, silks, and perfumes from China, wheat from Thessaly, sugar from Europe. All were purchased from the Arab merchants and carried back to Venice, or to the various ports of northern Europe. In the year 1454, a merchant galley was leaving Venice for the Netherlands with a spirited Venetian aboard who had a share in the cargo and was setting out, he said, to seek his fortune by any means possible. Alvise Cadamosto was the name of the young merchant. As it happened, in seeking his fortune, he was to take part in the greatest adventure of his age, the search for a sea route to India, and he was to sail for one of the most outstanding men of any age, Henry the Navigator, Prince of Portugal. Though his name was known, the Portuguese prince was a man of mystery, almost a legendary character. Living for years on lonely Cape St. Vincent, the southwest point of Portugal, he had been sending out caravels year after year from the harbor of Lagos to explore the coast of Africa and discover a new route to India. Cadamosto's ship, leaving Venice, was bound for the wealthy city of Bruges in the Netherlands, seat of the Duke of Burgundy. He had made the trip before with no difficulty, this time as they sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar and rounded Cape St. Vincent. A full blast from the Atlantic struck with such fury that it blew the ship into the harbor of Lagos. There he was in Prince Henry's harbor. Rising above him was the huge sacred rock, scoured smooth by wind and waves. On top of the rock was the city which the prince had built for the use of his captains, scientists, engineers, map-makers, and his court. Nearby in the shipyards, the Portuguese ships which Prince Henry had designed were being built. Prince Henry was at his villa, 3 miles inland, where he often went to think and work, when he received word that a ship from Venice had taken refuge in his harbor. He sent his secretary to accompany the Venetian consul to the ship and reminded him to take products that might be of interest to the merchant captain. Cadamosto was excited by what the visitors brought. They had samples of sugar from an island in the Atlantic called Madeira, discovered about 30 years ago and now colonized and cultivated with fields of sugarcane and vineyards. The sugar was a very fine grade. He fingered it and tasted it and found it quite as fine as that which the Venetians brought from Egypt. The Arab traders charged so much for their sugar that only the very rich in Europe could afford to use it. Here was sugar at prices that Europeans could afford to pay. Cadamosto had planned to stop at Madeira on his way back from Bruges. When he heard about the wealth and adventure to be had in Africa, he gave up all idea of going on to the Netherlands. Let the ship go on without him. He would go to Africa. How soon could he start? On what terms? What security would Prince Henry require? The secretary in the Venetian council said they would take Cadamosto to meet Prince Henry himself. On that day in 1454, Prince Henry the Navigator was a man of 60 years, dark, thick-set, and of medium height. His forehead was furrowed, and his skin had the brown, weathered look of a seasoned mariner who had spent most of his life at sea. Actually, Prince Henry had rarely been to sea, probably never beyond the sight of land. His had been an adventure of the mind. Over the years, he had planned the voyages, supplied maps and charts, furnished the ships, and strengthened the faith and purpose of the captains who sailed and won the glory. Prince Henry was not concerned with glory. His satisfaction came from doing something well. When he was a young knight and he had set out to test his sword on the battlefield, the motto that he chose was, "The power to do well." He had then gone with his 2 older brothers to fight against the Muslims in North Africa. Just across the Strait of Gibraltar in Morocco, the 3 Portuguese princes had attacked the Moors and captured their city of Ceuta, the first European base on the African continent. Prince Henry stayed on as governor of the city for a number of months. The facts that he learned about this great unknown continent were the beginning of his life work. Desert Arabs told him of caravan routes that led eastward to the Red Sea, of Bedouin tribes who lived on the edge of the Sahara Desert. They told of Berber tribes to the west and kingdoms deep in green jungles to the south. All North Africa was Muslim as far as the Red Sea. Muslims also held all harbors where European ships picked up spices from India. There was no way by land of reaching Asia or India without going through their territory. Why not try, then, to discover a sea route which would circle below the land of the Muslims south around Africa? Here Prince Henry encountered the belief that to sail south was dangerous. The ocean boiled, and the searing heat would burn men. The waters ran downhill, so no ship that went could ever come back. In this the prince detected a grain of truth. The way of the wind was such that a regular square-sailed vessel might have little chance of bearing its way north again. But surely ships could be designed to overcome this problem. On his return to Portugal, the king, his father, made him governor of the southern province. There, alone with his dream, he found the perfect place to develop his plans, the lonely Sagres, or sacred rock, known as Cape St. Vincent. For many years after Prince Henry sent out his first explorers, his efforts were ridiculed as being costly and absurd. His father, the king, however, continued to have faith in his son until he died. Not many years later, criticism and ridicule were replaced by admiration, amazement, and an eagerness to share in any and all of the companies the prince formed. This about-face was due to an event that was no part of Prince Henry's purpose or desire. In the summer of 1444, 6 ships from Africa reached the harbor of Lagos, loaded with slaves. Bringing these slaves to Europe started indirectly with the capture of a Berber chief who had been taken to Portugal by Nuno Tristram, one of Prince Henry's earliest and best explorers. Nuno Tristram sailed the first caravel that Prince Henry had built, and used the first manual ever written for navigators, which contained rules for observing the North Star. Adahu, a tall Berber chieftain, and 2 young boys were captured on the coast of Morocco and taken back there a year or so later by another explorer. In exchange, the explorer was given gold dust and 10 adult Negroes, the first ever taken to Europe. Nuno Tristram, meanwhile, had gone out again, sailing this time as far as Arguin Bay, south of Cape Blanco. Near the mainland, where Prince Henry had built a fort and a trading post, Tristram anchored his caravel. Natives, curious to investigate the strange, huge bird, paddled out in their canoes. Unfortunately, 14 of them were seized and carried away to Portugal. Other Portuguese captains who were greedy were quick to see profit could be made. On August 8, 1444, 6 ships filled with African natives for sale were unloaded in the harbor of Lagos. A Portuguese chronicler described the sad scene. Very early, because of the heat, the sailors began to fill the boats and take the captives ashore. It was an astonishing sight. Even the hardest heart would have been moved to pity, seeing them gathered together, for some bowed their heads with their faces bathed in tears. Others groaned and raised their faces to the heavens for help. And I, who wrote this history, have seen them in Lagos. None of the Africans brought to Portugal were ever mistreated. They learned trades, they intermarried, and they were soon looked upon as any other Portuguese peasant. Why did it not seem to Prince Henry that slavery was wrong? How could he imagine a world without slaves? There had always been slavery since the beginning of time, in the days of the Romans, in the time of Christ. Any conquered nation had its inhabitants taken as slaves. All Europeans who now sailed the Mediterranean might be captured at any time by pirates and end their days in slavery. African tribes fighting one another sold the women and children they captured to Berber traders who went down from Morocco to the great inland trading center of Timbuktu. Slavery was a sad, long-lived blight on the face of humanity. Nuno Tristan was killed in 1446 by natives on the Gambia River, which he had discovered. In 2 small boats, he and his men went upstream into the steamy green darkness of the jungle. Soon they were surrounded by canoes and struck by a blizzard of arrows, the heads of which had been steeped in poison. Nuno died, and only 5 got back to the caravel, 4 boys and a young clerk. Not strong enough to pull up anchor, they cut the chain and drifted out to sea. The natives salvaged the anchor and took it to their chief as a fine trophy. The death of Nuno Tristram, who had been the ideal explorer, was a great loss to Prince Henry. Since the slave trade began, it had been difficult for him to find captains who would carry on with exploration and not stop at the first possible place to pick up a load of slaves and hurry home. Now Prince Henry was hoping, as he talked with the animated Cadamosto, that in this young Venetian he had at last found another true explorer. His constant fear was that the captains, in their greed for slaves, might try to take them by force, so he laid down the rule that the men who sailed for him must never fight against the natives except in self-defense. All relations with the people of Africa, he explained to Cadamosto, were to be made in good peace with their consent, and peace was to be established by tact and not by force. In this year of 1454, to his great satisfaction, Pope Nicholas had granted the Portuguese the monopoly of exploration as far as India, and this very year might see the sea route opened, possibly by Cadamosto. How and on what terms, the young Venetian inquired, might he undertake this expedition? Prince Henry gave him 2 choices. Either Cadamosto could equip a caravel at his own expense and pay 1/4 of the profits to Prince Henry on his return, or the prince himself would provide and equip the caravel and take 1/2 of the profits. Cadamosto chose the latter arrangements. Whatever extra money he had, he spent on merchandise to trade. Impatient to be off after what seemed, he said, like many, many days, he set out from Lagos in a brand new caravel. His first stop in Africa was to be the Senegal River.